Good morning. My name's Ken Germanson. I live in Milwaukee. I am a retired labor union representative, and I've known Larry Penn since about 1966-67. I'm currently president emeritus of the Wisconsin Labor History Society, which is a society that preserves and promotes a labor history and seeks to have it being taught in our schools. And that's basically where I got involved with Larry, was through the labor movement. I first met Larry when we kind of ran into each other at St. Veronica's Church when we were both members there. Both of us had large families, which we attended that church at the same time. And when the civil rights movement was strong, Larry got involved very much with the marches. And with a bass player by the name of Bill Brown, they used to march along with Father Grappi and the rest of those groups during the late 1960s. In the interim, our area of Milwaukee was represented by an alderman by the name of Bob Anderson, who about 1966-67, when all this stuff was going on, said, and there was an open housing bill introduced into the Common Council by Alderman Val Phillips. He said people in his ward were 6,000 to 1 against open housing. Well, I looked around at my wife and people like Larry Penn and his wife Pat and other of our friends who were in Alderman Anderson's district, and says, well, no, there are a number of us who support civil rights activities. So we decided that we needed to have a counter group formed called Community 19. As I recall, our very first meeting was in the living room on South First Place of Larry and Pat Penn. There were perhaps 15, 16 of us crammed into his living room, and that was the birth of Community 19, which over the next 4 or 5 years did an awful lot to build support among our neighbors for more progressive ideas. We held voter forums, candidate forums. We even did a online survey, a telephone survey with volunteers. Anyway, to make a long story short, we were very deeply involved in that role. And that's how I got to know Larry. And he introduced us to the coffee house Sunday night concerts, as I recall they were, on 18th or 19th in Wisconsin. And it was at that point that Larry began doing a lot of social justice songs. I recall particularly Shorewood Man. And that was at a time when Shorewood was a lot different than it is today as far as its politics and feelings go about civil rights. And it was a very clever song, and Larry always had a way of being able to take social issues and create shall I say, an issue with a humorous twist, and to really help bring the point home. At that point, I was an active, labor union leader, and I knew Larry was a long-time Teamster and a strong union supporter. So I suggested he could do some more labor songs, and together we would come and sit down in our basement recreation room here, which had an old upright piano, and we'd work out songs. I mean, they were all Larry's melodies, Larry's lyrics, but Larry lacked the knowledge of music sufficient to be able to put it down on paper and to provide chords for it that would fit. So I took that chore, as amateur as I was, and did a couple of his early songs, which thankfully he gave eventually to a couple people who knew what they were doing, and cleaned them up. And it was at that point that I started to introduce Larry into various labor venues where he could do his labor songs. And he learned all the traditional songs like Solidarity Forever, Union Made, Which Side Are You On, and so forth. And then created his own songs. One of the most popular ones, which even his friends now sing after his passing, is Trickle On Down, Trickle On Down, and on the banks of the Ohio, as I recall. And when the maquiladoras were stealing our jobs, he had the maquiladora song. And there were a number of others through the years. Of course, most people now know him for his railroad songs and some other social commentary, but I still think his civil rights era efforts were really legendary, and I don't think they should be forgotten.
Pete Seeger once said that Larry's music was as good as anything that Woody Guthrie composed, and that's quite a compliment, and I think you're hitting on that very same sentiment in what you're saying.
That is exactly correct, Rev. And I mean, Larry liked to think he was a poet, and I think that's really what he truly was, because his lyrics had that poetry which fit so well to the music. I mean, and I think those should be preserved for forever.
Yes, and what if you were to describe Larry Penn's music to somebody who had never heard it? How would you describe him?
Well, it was kind of rough music, first of all, to start with, but that was its charm, and that was his ability to take tunes and adapt them to meaningful words. And the adaptation was always perfect, at least as far as I was concerned. The words fit the music, and the music fit the words. And that made it very listenable, and you wanted to listen because there was always a little twig of humor in there. And he did some songs that were not of particular topical interest, but yet had a lot of humanness. I think maybe that's what Larry brought to his folk music, was a humanness. The other thing I would like to say about his labor songs, and that's that most of today's labor folk singers are college professors who took up the skill of guitar playing to express their knowledge of history and so forth as far as working people go. Larry, however, was a truck driver. He had been a house mover, he had been a long distance driver, and he was a local cartage driver at the end. He knew trucks, he knew how to tarp down, he knew the whole ball game.
Yeah.
So he worked with his hands.
Yes.
And so he was a true worker and a folk singer second. Actually, I would like to put it as a worker, a poet, and a folk singer in that order.
Yeah, there are so many different sides to Larry Penn. I mean, one could talk about him as a father or a grandfather. One could talk about him as a toy maker. One could talk about him as the depth of his knowledge and love of all things American Railroad. His groundbreaking study and folkloric efforts to capture boxcar graffiti.
Yes, really.
He has
yeah.
an exhibit that is truly Americana. It's truly American folklore and should be shared in museums across the country. There are few exhibits like it, and there's just so many different qualities to his interests and his ability. And as you said, very succinctly, is the human authenticity that Larry was able to convey in his music and in his demeanor as he went about things. He had an elegant simplicity to him.
Exactly right, and he was very direct. You knew when he didn't agree with you, and usually he was right. Occasionally he was wrong, but I'm not sure he would admit it. We had a running joke that ran all the years that I knew him, because I'm a piano player, and he would say disdainful things about piano
Also
players.
ukulele for a while there too.
Also ukulele, and you knew he actually said it, I think, with love, Rev, and that just went on and on, and so he was. I would just like to comment, since we lived fairly close together, I suppose about 6 blocks apart actually. And our kids were approximately the same age, was that he really was a very loving father. And I know in raising Alex, he showed that boy so much love. And as Alex grew older and into his 20s, he really was a more difficult child to have around the house, just because of his incapacities. But Larry resisted right to the end, sending him off into some other venue, and I think that just shows the sacrifice that he and Pat were, ready to have. And we would often bump into each other at the store, for instance, and share our tales of woe about our kids who, and his favorite saying, he says, "Why do they have to repeat all the mistakes that you and I made?" And so I said, well, that's the story of life. So, no, Larry was a fond friend, true friend, and very honest, just about as honest
I couldn't agree more.
A man who walked this earth, and that's why I think he is so revered.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ken, all of these memories for the Larry Penn Legacy Project. We hope to talk to you again. Consider this a first attempt at keeping alive the legacy of Larry Penn. And we would also like to thank you for all that you've done here in Milwaukee with labor history and all of your work to preserve this rich tradition. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rev. It has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you, Ken.